Imagine it's the 14th of March, 2001. You're a 42-year-old accountant living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your apartment is modest but comfortable. 3 bedrooms, a small balcony overlooking a tree-lined street in the Palermo neighborhood, a place you bought with 15 years of careful saving. You have around $40,000 sitting in a Banco Nación savings account. You drive a 1998 Ford Falcon. Your daughter just started university. Your wife teaches elementary school. Life is not glamorous, but it is stable. It is yours. Every morning you walk to the same cafe on Avenida Santa Fe, order a cortado, read the paper, and feel cautiously like everything is going to be fine. If you have ever wondered why some people walk out of an economic collapse with their wealth intact, even growing, while others lose everything overnight, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is not a forecast. It is a pattern that has repeated across 6 continents and 14 major economies over the last 100 years. A pattern about 5 specific types of assets. A pattern about who survives when the system starts breaking and who does not. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people will never see coming. Back to Buenos Aires. By December of that same year, 2001, everything your accountant neighbor built over 15 years had been frozen. The Argentine government had introduced what they called the corralito, a banking restriction that limited cash withdrawals to just 250 pesos per week. That $40,000 in the bank account, technically still there, practically unreachable. Then came devaluation. The peso, which had been pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar for a decade, collapsed. By early 2002, the exchange rate hit 3 pesos to the dollar. That $40,000 became, in real purchasing power, something closer to $13,000. A lifetime of savings reduced by 2/3 in 90 days. Not stolen, not lost in a bad investment. Just quietly dissolved by the mechanics of a system that had been rotting from the inside for years. This video is about 5 assets that have historically held their value, and in many cases dramatically increased in value, precisely when events like Argentina 2001 begin to unfold, not during good times, during the bad ones, during the kind of slow-motion crises that governments downplay, economists argue about, and ordinary people only recognize after the damage is done. Understanding these 5 assets will not tell you what to do with your money. That is not what this channel does. But understanding the historical record, clearly, honestly, with real numbers and real names, is the only way to stop being the person who finds out too late. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about how economic systems actually break. Most people imagine collapse as a sudden event, a single crash, a single day. The morning the news is catastrophic and everything changes. But the historical record tells a different story. Economic breaking points are almost never sudden. They are gradual, they are quiet. They look, for a long time, exactly like stability. The rot is in the beams, not on the surface. The structure appears solid right until the moment it does not. Think of it like a dam. A dam does not fail because of one crack. It fails because of 100 small cracks that were each dismissed as manageable, until the water found a path through all of them at once. Economic systems work the same way. Argentina's crisis in 2001 had been building since at least 1998. The signs were there. The debt levels were there. The rigid currency peg that made exports uncompetitive was there. But for 3 years, people were told the fundamentals were sound. In Lebanon, the banking system's collapse in 2019 had been structurally inevitable for at least a decade before depositors lost access to their savings. In Weimar Germany, the hyperinflation of 1923 did not appear from nowhere. It was the accumulated consequence of war reparations, money printing, and political dysfunction that stretched back to 1918. The mechanism behind all of these events shares a common core. A government or financial system becomes unable to meet its obligations. To avoid acknowledging that inability openly, it uses one or more of 3 tools. It prints money, which dilutes the value of everyone's savings. It restricts access to money through capital controls or bank freezes. Or it defaults on debt, which destroys the institutions and contracts that ordinary people depend on. Each of these 3 tools transfers wealth. It does not destroy wealth. It moves it, from the unprepared to those who understood what was coming. And it positioned themselves accordingly. The 5 assets we are about to examine are the historically documented destinations of that transferred wealth. The first asset is physical gold. Not gold ETFs, not gold mining stocks. Physical gold, the kind you can hold. This distinction matters enormously and is one of the most consistently misunderstood points in financial history. So let us be precise about it. During the Weimar Republic hyperinflation of 1923, one of the most documented economic catastrophes in recorded history, Germany's prices rose at a rate that by November of that year required 100 billion marks to buy what 1 mark had bought in 1914. That is not an exaggeration. By October 1923, prices were doubling roughly every 3.5 days. Workers were paid twice a day and given time off to spend their wages before the purchasing power evaporated. A wheelbarrow full of cash could barely buy a loaf of bread. But throughout all of this, throughout every stage of that collapse, physical gold retained its purchasing power with extraordinary precision. A single ounce of gold that could buy a respectable men's suit in 1914 could still buy a respectable men's suit in 1924 after the hyperinflation had ended and the currency had been reset. The paper had gone to zero. The gold had simply remained gold. This pattern is not unique to Germany. In Zimbabwe between 2007 and 2009, when inflation reached an estimated 89.7 sextillion%, that is a number so large it is almost meaningless in everyday terms. But to put it plainly, a loaf of bread that cost $1 Zimbabwe dollar in 2007 cost hundreds of billions of Zimbabwe dollars by 2008. Those Zimbabweans who held physical gold or had access to foreign gold coins maintained purchasing power that paper savers did not. A gram of gold could still be exchanged for food, fuel, or medicine long after the Zimbabwe dollar had become a historical curiosity. In Argentina during the 2001 crisis, Argentines with physical gold stored outside the banking system were not affected by the corralito. The bank freeze applied to bank accounts. It did not apply to the gold coin in the sock drawer or the small bar kept in a home safe. This is not a romantic story about doomsday preppers. This is a documented pattern of behavior among ordinary middle-class families who had lived through previous Argentine crises in 1989 and understood, through lived experience, that the metal outlasts the system. The mechanism here is straightforward. Gold is not anyone's liability. A currency note is a promise from a government. A bank deposit is a promise from a bank. Gold is a thing. It cannot be printed, it cannot be frozen in a digital account, it cannot be devalued by a policy decision made at 3 a.m. by a finance minister under pressure. That quality, the quality of being no one's promise, becomes extraordinarily valuable precisely when promises start breaking. This brings us directly to the second asset, and this one surprises people: land, specifically productive agricultural land. Not urban real estate, which can collapse in value during economic crises just as dramatically as financial assets, but farmland. Land that produces something, land with water access, land that feeds people, regardless of what the currency is doing. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When was the last time you heard anyone in a mainstream financial conversation seriously discuss agricultural land as a store of value? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story most people never hear, and it changes the way you read the last 100 years of economic history entirely. During the Soviet Union's collapse between 1989 and 1991, one of the largest and most rapid economic disintegrations in modern history, the GDP of Russia fell by roughly 40% over just 5 years. Industrial output collapsed. The ruble became worth fractions of its former value. Savings held in state banks were devastated by inflation that reached over 2,000% in 1992. But the families in rural areas who held small plots of land, the dacha plots, the small village allotments, had something that the urban apartment dwellers did not. They could grow food. They could barter food. They had a physical asset whose utility was entirely independent of the financial system that was collapsing around them. This was not a romantic regression to peasant life. It was a documented survival mechanism. Studies of household consumption in Russia during the early 1990s showed that families with access to land plots maintained caloric intake and barter capacity that urban wage earners without land access simply could not match. The land produced value, actual, physical, edible value, regardless of what the ruble was doing. In Zimbabwe, the situation was more complex and more brutal, but the underlying dynamic was identical. Those who controlled productive farmland controlled the only real wealth that remained stable during hyperinflation. Food became the true currency when the official currency collapsed. An acre of land producing maize had purchasing power that no amount of Zimbabwe dollar banknotes could match. The mechanism is the same as with gold, but expressed differently. Agricultural land is productive. It generates something real, something that human beings need to survive. And in periods when financial systems break, the relationship between paper claims and real things inverts. Paper becomes cheap. Real things become precious. Farmland sits at the very foundation of that hierarchy of real things. The third asset in this historical pattern is foreign currency, specifically the reserve currencies of stable economies. In most historical crises, this has meant the US dollar. In some contexts, the Swiss franc, the German mark, and later the euro. The common thread is a currency issued by a government whose own financial system is not the one currently breaking. The Lebanese banking collapse of 2019 provides perhaps the most visceral recent illustration of this pattern. Between 2019 and 2022, The Lebanese pound lost over 95% of its value against the dollar. A Lebanese pound that could buy $1's worth of goods in 2019 could barely buy 4 cents worth of those same goods by 2022. This was not a gradual decline. It was a free fall. And it happened to a country with a highly educated population, a sophisticated banking sector, and a history of economic resilience. It happened to people who were told repeatedly that the banking system was sound. But within Lebanon, those who held dollar cash, physical paper dollars outside the banking system, not dollar-denominated bank accounts, which were frozen just like pound accounts, retained purchasing power with remarkable consistency. The black market exchange rate became the real economy. Merchants priced goods in dollars. Landlords demanded dollar rent. A Lebanese professional who had quietly kept a few $1,000s in physical cash at home was living in a different economic reality from a neighbor whose equivalent savings were in the banking system. This pattern appears consistently in economic crisis literature. In Argentina 2001, the phrase dolarización informal, informal dollarization, described a phenomenon that had been running for years before the official crisis. Argentine families had been quietly converting pesos to physical dollars and storing them outside banks because they remembered the hyperinflation of 1989, when the peso's predecessor, the austral, had lost 90% of its value. By some estimates, Argentine households collectively held more physical U.S. dollar cash than any country outside the United States itself. Figures range from $50 to $80 billion in private hands. Those dollars survived the corralito intact. The bank accounts did not. The mechanism here is not complicated. When a country's financial system breaks, it breaks in that country's currency. The crisis is denominated in pesos, or pounds, or rubles, or bolivars. A currency issued by a separate government with separate fiscal and monetary policies does not share that country's specific failure. It is financially portable in a way that domestic assets are not. It crosses borders in a pocket. It operates outside the domestic banking system. In extreme cases, it becomes the de facto medium of exchange for a parallel economy that forms beneath the collapsing official one. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand, reading quarterly statements for accounts they have never examined with real skepticism, assuming that what happened in Beirut or Buenos Aires or Harare was a problem of those countries, backward countries, mismanaged countries, countries that made specific, avoidable mistakes. But the historical record does not support that comfort. Most of those crises were presided over by finance ministers with degrees from Ivy League universities. Most of them were managed by central banks that published reassuring statements right up until the moment they could not. If you are still here, you are not most people. Subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. The fourth asset is commodities with universal demand: oil, copper, wheat, natural gas, the raw materials that industrial civilization requires, in order to function regardless of what any particular currency is doing. This asset class behaves differently from gold and foreign currency in an important way. It does not just preserve value. In specific types of crises, it actively inflates in price while everything else deflates. To understand this, we need to look at 1970s America. This is often not included in lists of economic crises because the United States did not experience a banking collapse or a hyperinflationary spiral. But what happened between 1971 and 1980 was, for American savers, a slow-motion wealth transfer. When President Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold in August 1971, effectively terminating the Bretton Woods system, he unleashed inflationary forces that took nearly a decade to resolve. Between 1971 and 1980, consumer price inflation in the U.S. averaged 7%. At certain points, like 1979 and 1980, it exceeded 13% annually. For someone holding a savings account earning 3 or 4% interest, this meant that they were losing real purchasing power every single year. Their nominal balance grew. Their actual ability to buy things shrank. The number went up. The wealth went down. This is the quiet robbery that most people never recognize as robbery. But during the same period, oil prices increased by roughly 10 times. The price of crude oil went from under $3 a barrel in 1972 to over 30. Copper prices increased substantially. Agricultural commodity prices surged. Those who had exposure to commodity markets watched their holdings outpace inflation. This was not luck. It was the mechanical consequence of money losing purchasing power while physical goods retained theirs. A similar pattern appeared in the Venezuelan crisis that accelerated from 2013 onward. Venezuela's economy had been built almost entirely on oil revenue. When oil prices fell sharply after 2014, the government responded with money printing on a scale that produced inflation figures that eventually exceeded 1,000,000%. But here is the counterintuitive historical observation. Even within Venezuela, those with access to oil-denominated assets or export commodities had access to dollars. The oil sector, even a collapsing one, generated foreign currency in a way that the domestic economy could not. Commodities acted as a lifeline. The mechanism is the relationship between real and nominal values. Nominal means the number. Real means what that number can actually buy. In currency crises, nominal values become meaningless very quickly, but commodities are priced globally. A barrel of oil does not care what the local bank is doing. This connection to global pricing makes physical commodities one of the few asset classes that maintains its connection to real value when financial systems detach. And this leads to the fifth asset: practical skills and productive small enterprises. Not financial assets at all, something entirely different. In every major economic crisis, the individuals who maintained the most resilient standard of living were those who could produce something that other people needed. A mechanic who could fix engines, a baker who had flour, the person with a practical skill that couldn't be devalued, frozen, or inflated away. In Weimar Germany, historians document a social inversion where factory workers found themselves in a stronger position than lawyers because they produced physical goods. In the Soviet collapse, the underground shadow economy operated entirely on the basis of practical skills and real goods, sustaining millions while official systems collapsed. For those who owned small productive businesses, the assets represented an operational asset that generated value every day in whatever currency was functioning. Financial assets preserve wealth, productive assets generate it, and in the worst conditions, generation matters more than preservation. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you.